Dracula, what if the thirst was a plague no one could stop? A modern what-if retelling. Chapter 1, Patient Zero. From the Field Journal of Jonathan Harker, recovered later and entered into the case record. I did not understand when I set out that the most dangerous thing I would carry home would be something I could not see. I had been sent east on what my firm described as a routine asset assessment, an old estate in a remote valley of the Carpathians, changing hands after generations, and someone had to go and walk the grounds and sign the papers and confirm that the thing being bought was the thing being sold. I was young and eager and glad of the assignment. I remember thinking, on the long train and the longer road that followed it, that I was fortunate. I remember the LAST Chinese letter before the valley, and the way the people there changed when I told them where I was going. They had been friendly until then. Then a woman pressed something into my hands, a small charm. I did not know what it was for and would not take it back. And an old man said a word I did not understand, and the innkeeper's wife wept, actually wept, and asked me not to go, or if I must go, not to stay after dark, and above all not to let him touch me, not even to shake my hand. I laughed it off, in the way that a modern person laughs off the fears of people he has decided are backward. That is the first thing I have to record, and the most shameful. I treated their terror as superstition. They were not superstitious. They had simply lived beside the thing long enough to know it, and had no other language for it than the old one. The estate was reached by a road that climbed until the trees gave out. The house was very old and very well kept, which struck me even then as a strange combination, an old thing without the decay that old things wear. My host was waiting. I will not be able to describe him well, and I have thought about why. He was old, that was the first impression, an impression of great age, and yet his face when he came close was not an old man's face. It was unlined. Its color was wrong, too pale and then, at moments, too flushed, as if the blood underneath were not being managed the way a living person's blood is managed. He was courteous, learned, endlessly interested in me, and in the country I came from, in its cities, its crowds, its trains, and its density, how many people, he kept asking, live so close together now, breathe the same rooms, touch the same rails, move so fast between one place and the next. I thought it was the curiosity of an isolated man about the modern world. I understand now it was the curiosity of a predator being told, in detail, about a new and abundant hunting ground. I stayed 3 days because the paperwork required it and because he was, I will admit, a fascinating host. In those 3 days, small wrong things accumulated the way they do in dreams, each one dismissible alone. He was never present in daylight, and I never saw him take food or drink. There were no other servants, though the house ran as if there were many. A cut I took on my hand while opening a stiff window drew his attention with an intensity that I found, for one instant, frightening, before he mastered it and turned away. And once, near the end, I woke in the night certain I was not alone, and felt at my throat a cold that I told myself was a draft, and in the morning found 2 small marks there that I told myself were an insect's, because those were the explanations available to a modern man, and I was determined to be a modern man. On the 3rd day I signed the papers and he thanked me and told me, I remember the exact courtesy of it, that I had given him a great gift, more than I knew, and that he hoped soon to repay my country's hospitality by visiting it himself. I left the next morning. The people in the village would not meet my eyes when I passed back through, and the woman who had given me the charm looked at me the way you look at someone at a funeral, and I did not understand, and I went home. I want it recorded plainly because everything that followed grew from it. I felt fine. That is the horror at the center of this whole account, the thing I most need whoever reads this to understand. I felt entirely well. I was tired from travel, a little pale, my appetite strange. Nothing a long journey would not explain. There was no moment of transformation, no fever, no clear line between before and after. I came home to my life and my work and the woman I was going to marry, and I embraced my friends, and I shook hands, and I rode the crowded trains, and I breathed the shared rooms of the dense, fast, modern world I had so helpfully described to my host. And I carried in me, unfelt and invisible and already reaching for others, the thing he had given me in the night and called a gift. By the time the first of them fell ill, I had touched 100 lives without knowing. That is not a metaphor. I have since tried to count them and I stopped because the counting does not end. Chapter 2, the first case. From the clinical notes of Dr. John Seward. The first case I saw was Lucy Westenra, and I saw her because I loved her, not because I was her physician, and I have had to live with the fact that love made me slower to see what a stranger might have seen at once. Lucy was the most alive person I knew. I want that in the record before the rest of it, because the record will make her a patient, a curve, a vector, and she was none of those things. She was a young woman with a laugh you could find across a crowded room, and I was one of 3 men who had loved her that year, and she had chosen another, and I had made my peace with it because it was impossible to be near her and wish her anything but well. So when her mother wrote to me, worried, asking me as a friend and a doctor to look in on her, I went gladly and without alarm. The alarm came slowly, in the specific way that alarm comes to a physician who is watching something that does not fit anything he was trained to see. She was tired. That was all at first, a tiredness that rest did not touch. She had grown pale, and the pallor deepened week by week, and yet her heart was strong and her lungs were clear, and every test I could run came back describing a healthy young woman who was, inexplicably, fading. She slept badly, or rather she slept and did not wake rested, and she spoke of dreams she could not remember, and of waking sometimes near the window with no memory of having crossed the room. Her family thought it a nervous condition, a delicacy of temperament, and I let them think it because I had nothing better to offer, and because the alternative, that I did not understand what was happening to a woman I loved, was not one I could easily hold. The pallor was the symptom I kept returning to because it was the symptom of blood, and yet she was not bleeding. There was no wound, no loss I could find or measure, and still she grew paler, as if the blood were being spent somewhere I could not see. I tried the obvious thing in the end, the thing that should have been decisive. I gave her blood. Her chosen husband gave first, gladly, rolling up his sleeve without a question. And for a day, a single day, she rallied, color returned, her laugh returned, and I let myself believe. And then within days she was paler than before, as though whatever was taking it took faster now, took more, as though the fresh blood had only fed the thing that was draining her. And there was the other symptom, the one I did not write in the notes at first because I did not know how to write it clinically. She changed at night, not her body, herself. The Lucy of the daylight was frightened, gentle herself, clinging to us, begging not to be left alone after dark. But once or twice in the deep of the night, I sat with her and saw something else look out through her face, a hunger that was not hers, a coldness, a moment where she reached for me with an expression that had nothing of Lucy in it at all, before the daylight self surfaced again, appalled and weeping and not remembering. I told myself it was fever, delirium, the mind under strain. I had a word for everything. That was my training and it was my failure. I had a word for every single symptom, and because I had a word for each one alone, I never let myself see the shape they made together, which was not a word I possessed, which was not, I would come to understand, a word that modern medicine possessed at all. She also near the end bore 2 small marks at the throat. I noted them. I attributed them to the pin of a brooch, to a scratch, to anything. I was very good in those weeks at explaining each thing away, and I understand now that this is precisely how the thing moves, not by hiding, but by presenting itself as a dozen ordinary ailments to a profession trained to name ordinary ailments, so that every physician who meets it does exactly what I did and files it under something known, and does not raise the alarm, and lets it pass through his hands and out into the world. Because here is the part I did not know, the part none of us knew yet. In the same weeks Lucy faded, her mother took ill in the same way. A maid in the house grew pale and tired and dreamed bad dreams. A man Lucy had danced with at a party, whom I never met and only learned of afterward, took to his bed with a fatigue his own doctor called anemia and treated with iron and rest. I was watching one patient. I thought I was watching one tragedy. I was watching the second and third and fourth cases of something, and I did not know to look up from the bed in front of me and count. It was only when I had exhausted every explanation I owned, when Lucy was so pale that her skin seemed lit from behind, and her nighttime self came more often than her true one, that I did the thing I should have done at the start. I wrote to my old teacher. There was one man I had ever known whose mind did not stop at the edge of the textbook, who had spent his life at the strange margins of medicine where the known runs out. A man I half revered and half feared, because he took seriously things the rest of us had agreed to stop taking seriously. I did not believe he could help. I only knew I had reached the end of what I could name, and that Lucy was dying inside my careful vocabulary, and that I would rather be a fool with him than a competent man alone at her deathbed. I wrote to Professor Van Helsing and I told him everything, every symptom I had been so careful to explain away, and I asked him to come. His reply came faster than I thought possible. It was short. I have kept it, it said. Explain nothing further by letter. Touch no more of her blood. Let no one who has sat with her at night sit with anyone else until I have come. I am already on the road. Pray I am not too late, not for her only. You have been watching one candle. I am afraid of the fire. I read it 3 times. I did not understand it. I understand every word of it now. Chapter 3, The Specialist. From the clinical notes of Dr. John Seward, continued, and from the recorded statements of Professor Abraham Van Helsing. Van Helsing arrived on the night train, and the first thing he did when I met him at the station was not to greet me. He looked at my face for a long moment under the platform lights, and then he took both my hands in his and turned them over, examining them, and asked me quietly, so the porters would not hear, whether I had any cut, any scratch, any broken skin at all, and whether in the last 3 weeks I had swallowed anything of hers, shared any cup, been bled upon. I said no, bewildered. He held my gaze until he was satisfied I was telling the truth, and only then did he embrace me, and I felt him tremble, this man I had always thought of as unshakable, and I understood that he was not afraid of a disease. He was afraid the way a man is afraid who has seen a thing before and hoped never to see it again, and has just been told it has come back. We went straight to Lucy. He did not speak in the carriage. He sat with his eyes closed and his lips moving, and I thought at first he was praying, and then I realized he was rehearsing, going over, in some private catalog, everything he knew about a thing he had spent his life trying not to need to know. When he saw her, he was very gentle and very fast. He examined her the way I had, all the ordinary examinations, and then he did things I did not understand. He looked at the marks on her throat with a small glass and went absolutely still. He asked her family questions that seemed to have nothing to do with medicine, about her sleep, about the window, about whether anything came to it. He asked to see everyone who had sat with her at night, and when he learned that her mother had and a maid had and I had, his face did something I will not forget. He asked for the list, not her symptoms, the list of everyone she had been near, everyone who had bled for her, everyone who had shared her rooms in the dark. He wanted the names before he wanted anything else, and when I finally asked him why, he told me the thing that reorganized my entire understanding of what I had been watching. Because she is not the patient, John, he said. She is the wound. The patient is the whole town, and the town does not know it is sick yet, and the only map I have of the infection is the list of who has touched her. Give me the list and I can see the edges of the fire. Give me only the girl and I am a man staring at one ember, describing its color, while the roof catches above my head. Then he sat me down in the small hours, and he told me what it was, and I will set down what he said as nearly as I can, because everything we did afterward, everything we failed to do, began in that room. He did not use the old word at first. He built up to it, the way a careful man walks you toward a thing you will not want to believe. He said that there is a condition, very old, that appears in the records of every region and every century under 100 different names, always described as a curse or a demon or a visitation, because the people who met it had no other frame. But that stripped of its costume it behaves, he said, exactly like a disease, and that this was the discovery of his life and the terror of his life both. It has an agent, though he had never isolated it and did not fully understand it, something transmitted through the blood and the fluids and the breath of the close dark hours. It has a course. It has, above all, a pattern, and the pattern is what makes it more dangerous than any plague he knew. A good plague, he said, and he said good with a bitterness I had never heard from him. A good plague kills its host. That is its mercy, though no one calls it mercy. It burns hot, it kills fast, and a dead man infects fewer than a living one, and so the fire, however terrible, tends at last to burn itself out. This is not a good plague, John. This one does not kill. That is the whole of the horror. It changes. The one it takes does not die and lie still. The one it takes rises and walks and passes among the living wearing the face of the person they knew and trusted, and is driven not by malice, understand me, not by evil, but by a hunger as simple and as blameless as your hunger for your dinner, to do the one thing that spreads it. It is a disease whose single symptom is the compulsion to transmit itself. It has no interest in killing. It has no interest in anything but more. I asked him, I could barely ask it, whether he meant that Lucy, our Lucy, would become such a thing. I mean, he said, that she is already becoming it, and that the Lucy you love is fighting it in the only hours she still can and losing, and that when she loses entirely there will be a creature that has her face and her voice and her memories and none of her, and it will come to the people she loved, because it will know them and they will trust it, and it will not mean them any harm, and it will destroy them all the same. That is why I asked for the list. Every name on it may already be a candle, and every candle in the close dark lights the next. He was right about the course of it, and he was right too soon. Lucy's true self came less and less. There were hours near the end when I sat by her and it was not her, when the thing that was replacing her looked out through her eyes with that patient, hungry attention and spoke to me in her voice, and tried, with a gentleness more horrible than any violence, to draw me close, to have me sit nearer, to have me hold her hand and put my face near hers. Van Helsing never let me. He never let any of us be alone with her after dark, and I resented him for it in my grief, and he bore the resentment because he understood it, and because he was right. And still, for all his care, the list grew. The maid who had sat with Lucy in the first weeks fell ill in the same pattern in a house across the town. Lucy's mother, frail already, faded and was gone within the month, and even her death was not a death that stayed a death. And what Van Helsing had to do then, in the small hours, to keep her from rising and beginning her own list, is the thing I cannot write about, the thing that turned me from a doctor who doubted him into a man who would have followed him into any darkness. Because I saw, that night, that he was not a fanatic and not a madman. He was a physician doing the only treatment the disease permitted, which was not a cure. There was no cure, but the terrible surgery of severance, cutting the chain of transmission one dreadful link at a time, and hating every cut, and doing it anyway because the alternative was the fire. When at last Lucy was fully gone, when the creature had entirely replaced her, and had begun, in her turn, her own quiet contagious errands among the people who still thought her merely sick, Van Helsing gathered the small circle of us who had loved her. Myself, her betrothed, the American who had also courted her and stayed on out of loyalty, and Jonathan Harker and his new wife Mina, who had come to help nurse her friend and who had, I now knew, their own thread in this that none of us yet fully understood. He gathered us in my study, and he laid it out without softening it. I have done for Lucy what had to be done, and I will not describe it and you will not ask, he said. Grieve her tomorrow. Tonight you must understand what she was, because she was not the beginning and she is not the end. She was one case. There are others already. I have found 4. I suspect a dozen. I fear 100 by now that no doctor has connected because each doctor sees only his own ember and calls it anemia, or wasting, or nerves and treats it, and lets it walk back out into the streets. This thing is loose in the city. It is loose in a city of millions who touch and breathe and travel as no people in history have ever touched and breathed and traveled. He looked at each of us. I have fought this before in a valley in a village where it could be surrounded, where everyone knew everyone and the list could be walked door to door in a day. I contained it there. I will be honest with you because you deserve it and because I need you unafraid of the truth. I do not know if it can be contained here. I have never seen it reach a place like this. A village is a candle. This, and he gestured at the window, at the glow of the sleepless modern city beyond it. This is a forest, in a dry season, and somewhere in it, more than one tree is already burning. Chapter 4, Containment. Compiled from Mina Harker's journal, Dr. Seward's notes, and the working records of the group. We became, without ever quite deciding to, the thing Van Helsing needed us to be, not a family in mourning but a small unofficial machine for slowing a fire. Mina organized us. I should say that plainly because the records that survive are mostly the men's, and the men, myself included, were slower and prouder and more prone to despair. And it was Mina Harker who saw first that the only weapon we had against a thing that moved through connection was to become better at tracing connection than the thing was at making it. She had a mind built for exactly this, and a temperament built to bear it. She took Van Helsing's list, the names of everyone Lucy had touched, and she did not treat it as a list of the doomed. She treated it as a map. Every name was a node. Every node had touched other nodes. If we could trace the branches fast enough, she reasoned, we could find the people who were infected before they knew it, before they became contagious, and we could do what exactly we did not yet have a good answer for, and that gap would come to haunt us. But first we had to see the shape. You cannot contain what you cannot see. And Mina, alone among us, insisted that we look at the whole shape and not turn our faces from it. The shape was worse than Van Helsing had feared. Because the tracing revealed the thing that made this disease a nightmare of a wholly modern kind, the incubation. A person carried it, unknowing and unfeeling, for weeks, well and warm and ordinary, going to work, going to parties, riding the trains, kissing their children good night. And in all that time they were, in the close dark hours, without memory and without will, doing its quiet work. By the time the pallor came, by the time anyone thought to call a doctor, the carrier had already seeded a dozen more, and those dozen were now in their own silent weeks, seeding dozens further, and every branch we traced backward exploded into 3 or 4 branches we had not known about, and every one of those into 3 or 4 more. Mina's map, which she had begun on a single sheet, spread across the wall of my study and then across a second wall, and it was not a chain any longer. It was not even a tree. It was a net, and the net had no edge that we could find. And one night I watched her stand before it very still for a long time and then sit down and put her face in her hands, and I understood that she had done the arithmetic that the rest of us had been avoiding, and that the arithmetic did not have a bottom. And the city began to notice. This was the part Van Helsing had dreaded most, more even than the disease itself. Not the illness, but the fear of it, which he said always did more damage than the thing that caused it, because the illness at least was honest and the fear was not. It began with the doctors, who started, one by one, to see the pattern we had seen, to notice that their anemic patients and their nervous cases and their wasting young people all traced back through the same parties and streets and workplaces, and who began, quietly, to talk to each other. Then it reached the newspapers in fragments in careful language, a wasting sickness, an unexplained epidemic of anemia, and the careful language fooled no one, because people are not stupid, and a population can smell a lie meant to calm it, and the smell of that lie frightened them worse than the truth would have. What frightened them most was the one true thing that could not be hidden, you could not tell. That was the horror that got into the city and would not leave. In an ordinary plague, you can see the sick, the fevered, the marked, the dying, and you can flee them and shun them and feel, however cruelly, that you know where the danger is. This disease gave you nothing to see. The carrier was your neighbor, warm and well and smiling for weeks before any sign. The carrier was the man beside you on the train. The carrier was, Mina wrote in her journal in a line that has never left me, possibly yourself, and you would be the last to know it. And a city that cannot see its danger turns, inevitably and quickly, to seeing it everywhere. I watched a civilization's trust come apart in the space of a season, and it came apart faster than the disease itself. People stopped touching. Then they stopped gathering. Then they stopped trusting the ones who did not visibly fear, because the one who was calm, the one who moved through crowds unafraid, why was he unafraid? What did he know? What was he? The pale were shunned, of course, but pallor could be powder and rouge, and so the healthy-looking were suspected too, and there was no appearance a person could wear that did not, to a frightened enough eye, look like a mask over the thing. Denunciations began. Neighbors reported neighbors. A man was dragged from his house in the east of the city on no evidence but that he kept his curtains drawn by day, he worked nights. It turned out, he was a printer, he was nothing but tired, and what was done to him was done by ordinary people who 3 months before would have lent him a ladder. Van Helsing, when he heard of it, did not rage. He only looked very old and said, "There, you see, the disease takes them one at a time in the dark without malice. The fear of the disease takes them by the hundred, in daylight, with great conviction that they are doing good. I have never yet decided which of the two has killed more." He tried to work faster than both. We did what little the disease permitted. Where Mina's map found a carrier early, genuinely early, before transmission, Van Helsing had ways, imperfect ways, of interrupting the course. I will not detail them, they were not gentle and they did not always work, and each one cost him something you could watch leave his face. Where he found a carrier late, there was only the severance, the terrible surgery, and he did it, and it aged him a year each time. We saved some. I hold on to that because the rest of the account gives me little else to hold. There are people alive who would not be, because a schoolteacher named Mina Harker built a map on my study wall and refused to look away from it. But for every branch we cut, the net had grown 3 we had not reached, and we all knew it, and the knowing was its own slow illness in us. And then Van Helsing came to me one evening and closed the door, and told me the 2 things that ended the first phase of our war and began the last. The first was that he had traced the net backward past Lucy, past all the early cases, to its origin, to a single point of entry into the city, a returning traveler who had come from the east some months before feeling perfectly well, and who had, all unknowing, been the mouth through which the thing entered. He did not say the name yet. He only said that the origin was known to us. And I understood from the way he would not meet my eyes that it was someone in our own small circle, and my mind went unwillingly to the pale and haunted young man who never quite slept, who flinched from his own reflection, who had come back from a valley in the east and married soon after. And I understood that Jonathan Harker had carried it in, and that he did not know, and that Mina, who had built the map that would tell him, did not know yet either that the origin she was hunting was the man she had married. The second thing Van Helsing told me was worse, and he told it to me before he told them, because he needed one person steady when he said it aloud. He had examined Mina. She had grown pale these last weeks and tired, and had dreamed bad dreams she could not recall, and had woken once near the window, and we had all told ourselves it was the strain and the grief and the terrible work. It was not the strain. "She is infected," he said. "Our Mina, the one who has done more than any of us to save the others. The map maker is on her own map now." He sat down heavily. "And so I must tell you the thing I have been not saying since the night I arrived, John, because it is time. Cutting the branches will never end this. I could cut for 100 years and the net would grow faster than my knife. There is only one way this thing has ever truly been ended, in the old valleys, in the old records, not by treating the sick, but by going back to the source, to the first and oldest host from which every strain in the world descends, The one that does not die and does not stop and has been seeding valleys and villages and now cities for longer than anyone has counted, and by ending that. It is the root of the fire, and it is not here. It is where Jonathan went. It is waiting in that valley, well fed now on what he carried home and patient, and it will send the fire again and again down the years unless someone goes back to where the road climbs until the trees give out and puts it out at the root. He looked at me. Mina has weeks, perhaps less. The road east is long, so now at last we stop cutting branches. Now we go to the root, and we take her with us, because I will not leave her to become what Lucy became, and because, God forgive me, I think she is the only one of us clear-headed enough to help us find the way, even as it takes her. Chapter 5: The Curve. Compiled from the group's records, newspaper fragments, and Mina Harker's journal, the last kept even as her own condition worsened. I have set down what the city became in those weeks with as much restraint as I can manage, because the temptation is to reach for the language of nightmare, and the truth is worse than nightmare, because it was ordinary. It did not feel like the end of the world while it was happening. It felt like a great many ordinary things going wrong at once, each of them explicable, none of them by itself apocalyptic, and that is exactly how the world ends when it ends this way. Not in a single thunderclap, but in the quiet sum of 1,000 small failures, each one reasonable, until you look up one morning and the sum has become a thing with no name. Van Helsing had drawn us a curve once early on the back of one of Mina's map sheets. He had drawn a line that started flat and low and then bent upward, gently at first and then not gently, and then went up the side of the page and off it entirely, and he had said, "This is the shape of the thing if it is not stopped. For a long time it looks like almost nothing." That is the danger of it. For a long time you can tell yourself it is nothing because the line is low, and every day it is only a little higher than yesterday, and a little is not frightening. And then one day the little becomes a lot, and the day after that the lot becomes everything, and it is the same line the whole time. It never changed its nature. It was always going to reach the top of the page. We are somewhere on the flat part now. Everyone always thinks they are safe because they are on the flat part. No one is ever on the flat part. They are only early. We reach the steep part in the spring. The hospitals filled not with the dying, for the disease did not kill, but with the fading, the pale wasting hundreds whose own doctors had finally connected the pattern and no longer knew what to do with them. Because there was nothing to do, no treatment that touched it, and a hospital full of patients for whom there is no treatment is a strange and terrible place, quiet and crowded at once. And worse than the fading and the wards at night were the ones who had passed over, who had, in the dark hours, stopped being patients and become carriers, and who lay still and pale and warm through the day and rose in the night wearing the faces of the sick and moved among the other beds. The hospitals, which had gathered the infected together to care for them, had built without meaning to the most efficient engine of transmission the disease could have asked for. When the doctors understood this, some of them did the unthinkable and the necessary and closed the wards, turned the sick away at the doors, and the sick went home, into their families, into the streets, and the engine only moved from the hospitals out into the city entire. The authorities denied it, then minimized it then, when denial and minimization had cost the weeks that mattered panicked. I do not blame them as much as I once did. There was no good decision available. If they told the whole truth, the city would flee in every direction, and a fleeing population is a population that carries the fire down every road at once. Van Helsing said the worst thing a city can do with this disease is scatter, that the old villages survived precisely because no one could leave, and that a modern city's greatest strength, that its people could go anywhere, was now its executioner. So the authorities tried to prevent flight, which meant they had to hide how bad it was, which meant they lied, which meant that when the truth leaked, as it always does, the people believed nothing the authorities said anymore, including the true and vital things, including the one instruction that might have saved lives. Do not travel, which the people now heard as one more lie from liars and disobeyed on principle. The lie meant to prevent the panic became the reason the panic could not be governed. I have thought about that a great deal since. It is the truest thing I know about how people and their rulers fail each other in a catastrophe. The city did not fall in a day. The trains ran, then ran less, then stopped. The markets opened, then opened strangely, then did not. People went to work until enough people did not go to work that there was no work to go to. The ordinary machinery of a great city, which everyone had assumed was as permanent as the sky, turned out to be a habit, only a habit, sustained by nothing but the daily willingness of millions of people to behave as though tomorrow would be like yesterday. And when enough of them stopped believing that, the machinery simply stopped without drama, the way a heart stops. And through it all the line on Van Helsing's page kept climbing, indifferent to our denials and our panics alike, because it had never cared what we believed about it. It had only ever cared about more, and there was still, everywhere, more. And in our own house, on our own small terrible scale, the same curve was climbing through Mina. She fought it as Lucy had fought it, but Mina was made of something even Lucy had not been made of, and she fought it better and longer and with a clarity that broke my heart to witness. She kept her journal even as the pallor deepened, even as the bad dreams came every night now, even as she began to wake near windows with soil under her fingernails and no memory of the dark hours. She insisted, she demanded, that we use her. "I can feel it in me," she wrote, and later, when writing grew hard, said aloud to us, "And Professor, if it is in me, then some part of me is joined to the thing now, to all of it, to the source itself. Do you understand what I am offering you? I am becoming your enemy, but I am not there yet. And while I am still myself in the daylight, I am the only one of you who is also in some small growing part it, and I can feel at the edge of my mind where it is. Use that. Use me to find the road. Use me before I am no longer someone you can trust to be used." Van Helsing wept when she said it openly and did not hide it, and then he did the thing she asked, because she was right, and because there was no time to be anything but right. Jonathan learned, in those weeks, what he had carried home. Van Helsing told him gently and completely, and I watched a young man receive the knowledge that he was the mouth through which the fire had entered his city, that Lucy and her mother and the printer dragged from his house, and the filling hospitals and the wife he loved fading before him were all, every one, downstream of a hand he had shaken, and a window he had left open in a valley in the east. I thought it would destroy him. It did the opposite, or perhaps destruction and resolve are closer than we think. He became, from that hour, the most committed of us all, not from guilt exactly, though the guilt was bottomless, but because he understood better than any of us that he was bound to the source in his own way, that he had met it, seen its face, walked its house, and that if anyone was owed the task of going back to end it, it was the man who had let it out. "I carried it here," he said, very quietly, the night we made the decision. "I will carry the ending of it back." So it was decided. We would leave the burning city, the four of us who were well, and Mina who was not, and we would go east, back up the long road to where the trees give out, and we would find the root of the fire and put it out, and we would do it before the thing in Mina finished replacing her, using the very thing that was replacing her to guide us, in a race between our arrival at the source and her arrival at the far side of herself. Van Helsing marked a date on the calendar, an estimate, the day by which he believed Mina would be wholly gone. It was not far off. We packed that night. Behind us, as our train pulled east against the tide of everyone else fleeing every other direction, the city we were leaving glowed and guttered like the candle Van Helsing had named it. And I understood that we were the only people in the world traveling toward the thing that everyone else was running from, and that this was either the bravest act of my life or the most futile, and that I would not know which until it was much too late to choose otherwise. Chapter 6. Sources. From Jonathan Harker's journal, resumed, and the group's records of the journey east. Going back was nothing like going out. When I had first traveled east, months and a lifetime ago, The road had been merely remote, quiet villages, suspicious innkeepers, the slow narrowing of the modern world into something older. Now the same road was a road through the aftermath of ourselves, because the fire had not stayed in the city. It had gone out along every route that people flee upon, and we were following one of the oldest of those routes backward. And everywhere we passed we saw what the disease did to places smaller and slower than a great city. Some villages we came through were empty, not destroyed, simply empty, doors open, meals half-eaten on tables, as though everyone had stepped out for a moment weeks ago and never come back. Others had done what the old villages in Van Helsing's records had done, had turned inward and closed themselves off, would not let us pass, met us at the edge of the fields with whatever they had, and Van Helsing did not argue with them or resent them. He said they were doing the only thing that had ever worked, the thing the great city had been too vast and too connected to do, and that some of these closed villages might be the only things that survived, precisely because they had been backward enough to remember the old defense of the drawn boundary and the shut door. And in one village, deep in, we found people who remembered the disease by name, not the modern name, the old one, the one Van Helsing had built up to so carefully in my study, and who, when they understood where we were going, did not think us mad. They thought us doomed, which is different, and they helped us anyway, which is a kind of courage I had not understood before. An old woman there, the same age perhaps as the one who had pressed the charm on me on my way out, gave us things we needed and told us things Van Helsing already half knew, and confirmed the one thing we most needed confirmed. That up the valley, where the road climbs until the trees give out, the old house still stood, and that the thing in it had been there beyond the memory of anyone's grandmother's grandmother, and that it had gone quiet these last months. Quiet, she said, the way a thing goes quiet when it has fed well and is content and is waiting. It does not need to hunt now, she said, through Van Helsing's translation. You did its hunting for it. You went out from here full of it and you fed a whole world. Why should it stir? It has never in its life been so well fed. It is sleeping the sleep of the satisfied. If you would kill it in that sleep, before it wakes and remembers that it is still hungry, because it is always, in the end, still hungry. We climbed the last of the road, as Mina's calendar date came near. She was mostly gone by then, in the way the disease took people herself in the shrinking daylight hours, and something else the rest of the time, and the daylight hours coming later each morning and ending sooner each dusk. But even the something else was useful to us now, in a way that horrified all of us, including her, because as she joined more fully to the thing, she could feel the source more strongly, and in her clear moments she reported it to us like an instrument reporting a bearing. It is near now. It is above us. It is asleep, but it is not deeply asleep. It feels us coming, and it is not afraid. It is curious. It thinks we are more of the same. More mouths come home to be filled. She guided us up the last miles the way a compass needle guides, trembling toward the thing she was becoming, and she made us promise, in the last fully clear conversation any of us had with the woman she had been, that whatever happened at the top of the road, we would not choose her over the task. You did not come all this way to save one person, she said. You came to end the source. If you can do both, do both. If you must choose, you already know what to choose, and you will hate yourselves for it, and you will be right. Promise me you will be right. We promised. Van Helsing could not speak the words and only nodded, and she accepted the nod because she knew him and knew what it cost him. We reached the house as the light was failing on the day Van Helsing had marked on the calendar. It was exactly as I remembered it, and the memory of remembering it made me sick. The old thing without decay, the well-kept house on the well-kept grounds where nothing living should have kept anything, standing at the top of the road where the trees give out, patient, as it had been patient for centuries, waiting for its many mouths to come home. The others had never seen it. I watched them see it, watched Van Helsing look up at it with the face of a man meeting at last, in the flesh, the enemy of his entire life study. And I understood that for him this was not only the source of a plague, but the answer to a question he had carried since he was young. The question of whether the old thing in the old records was real, and that he had always known the answer and had spent his life hoping to be wrong, and was not wrong, and that being right here at the top of this road was the loneliest vindication a man could suffer. The light was almost gone. Van Helsing turned to us, and his voice was steady in the way that only enormous effort makes a voice steady. "It is sleeping," he said. "The old woman was right, I can feel it too now, or perhaps I only believe her, it does not matter. It has fed on half the world and it is content, and it will not expect us to have come to the root. It will expect, if it expects anything, more of its children coming home. We have until it wakes, and it will wake at full dark, and full dark is very near. Whatever we do it now in the last of the light in its sleep, or we do not do it at all." He looked at Mina, who stood swaying at the edge of the group, half in this world and half already in the other, her eyes on the house with a longing that was not her own. "And we do it," he said more quietly, "before the last of the light takes her too, because when it wakes it will call her and she will answer, and I do not know if even Mina can refuse it once it truly calls. So, into the house, while it sleeps, now." We went up the last steps toward the door I had walked through once as a fool who thought old villagers superstitious, and I put my hand on it, and it opened as it had opened before, as if it had been waiting, and the cold came out to meet us, and above the valley the last light went out of the sky. Chapter 7: The Long Winter. From the combined records of the survivors, assembled afterward by Mina Harker. I am the one who assembled this account, and so it falls to me to write its end, and I have put it off for a long time, because to write the end is to decide what the end was, and I am no longer certain that a thing like this has an end, or only a place where the records stop. They went into the house in the last of the light, and I went with them, though I was by then more its creature than my own, and I will set down what I can of what I remember, which is fragmentary, because I lived those hours in two places at once, in my failing body climbing the dark stairs beside the men I loved, and in some other place, joined to the sleeping thing above us, feeling the four of us approach through its own drowsy contentment as a distant, unimportant warmth. That is the truest horror I can offer, and I offer it because someone should. I could feel them hunting it, and I could feel it not caring that it was hunted, all at once, and neither feeling was more real than the other, and I understand now, better than any of them ever could, what the disease is. It is not cruel. It never was. It felt us coming the way you feel your own blood moving without alarm, because it did not conceive of us as a threat. We were its children coming home. Even I, who came to kill it, came home to it, and part of me was glad. We found it where the old woman said it would be, in the deep of the house, in the sleep of the well-fed. I will not describe it. Not from squeamishness, I have no squeamishness left, but because I have come to believe that the descriptions are part of how it survives. Every account that makes it a monster, a figure, a face with fangs, gives the next generation something to disbelieve, something to file under legend and laugh at, the way I once filed the fears of villagers. It is not a figure. It is the oldest and most patient case of a disease, the first host, the root from which every strain descends, and it looked in the last light like almost nothing, like an old thing that should have been dead centuries ago and was instead merely sated, and that ordinariness was the most frightening thing about it. And it is the thing the legends always leave out because the legends need it to be grand. Van Helsing did what he had come to do. I will not detail that either. He had spent his whole life learning how the chain of this thing is broken, and he broke it at its first link at the root in its sleep, before full dark could wake it, and it did wake at the very end for one moment. And in that moment it did the only thing it had ever done, which was to reach, out of pure blameless hunger, for the warm lives nearest it, and it reached for me because I was nearest, because I was already half its own and it knew me. And I felt myself begin to answer. And Jonathan, my Jonathan, who had carried it out into the world and sworn to carry the ending back, put himself between it and me, not with any weapon, only with his body and his will, and he held me hard, and said my name, my true name, the daylight name, over and over while Van Helsing finished it. And the pull of the thing rose in me like a tide, and then, all at once, when the root was severed, went slack. It did not go away. I need to be clear about this because it is the whole meaning of what we did and did not accomplish. Severing the root did not cure me. There is no cure. There was never a cure. That was the first and last truth Van Helsing ever taught us. What it did was stop the source. The thing that had been seeding the world for uncounted centuries would seed it no longer. Every new infection that would have flowed from it down the coming years simply would not come. But the infections already loose in the world were still loose. The city we had left was still burning. The villages still emptying were still emptying. And I was still and would always be what I had become, arrested now, held at the threshold, no longer being pulled across it but never brought back. When the root was cut, the something else in me did not die. It only stopped growing. I live now in the daylight self permanently, but I know the other is still there, quiet at the edge, the way a scar is still a wound that has agreed, for now, to hold its shape. We came down out of the valley into a changed world, and it did not welcome us as saviors because it did not know what we had done and could not have measured it if we had told them. This is the part the old stories never tell, the part that is true of every real plague and no legend. We ended the source, and the world did not notice, because you cannot notice the infections that never happen. There was no morning when the sick rose healed, no bells, no crowds. There was only a long descent of the curve that no one could credit to us, that most people credited to God, or to luck, or to the closed villages, or to nothing at all. The disease burned through what it had already reached, and it burned for a long time, longer than the war to end its source had taken, and it took people we knew and people we did not. And then slowly, because we had cut the root and no new fire came down from the mountains to feed it, it began at last to gutter, not because it was beaten, because it ran out of the fuel that the source would no longer replace. That is the shape of how it ended if it ended, not a victory but an exhaustion. The world came out the other side smaller and quieter and permanently marked. Whole towns were simply gone. A generation was thinned in a way the records would spend decades failing to add up, because the disease had killed almost no one directly and emptied the world all the same. And the historians who came after argued about the numbers and never agreed. And some of them, I have read, argue that it was never as bad as the survivors claim, that we exaggerate, that there was no single source and no old house on a road where the trees give out, that it was merely a wave of ordinary illness that ordinary fear made monstrous. I do not argue with them. Let them disbelieve. I told you at the start that disbelief is part of how the thing survives, and I have made my peace with being disbelieved, because the alternative, being believed, and having everyone understand that such a thing is real and can come again, is a burden I am not sure the world can carry and keep functioning, and the world must keep functioning. That is the one lesson I would pass on above all others. It must keep functioning, and touch, and gather, and trust, and travel, and love, because a world that stops doing those things to be safe from this is a world the thing has taken anyway, by another door. Van Helsing died a few years after, an old man in his bed in the daylight, which is more than he ever expected and less than he deserved. He told me near the end that he did not think we had ended it, not truly, not forever. We ended that source, he said. The oldest one, the deepest root. But John, I have wondered all my life whether it was ever only one root. A thing that old, that patient, that widely fed, I put out the fire at the root I could find. I do not know if it was the only root. I have chosen for my own peace to believe it was. You should choose your own belief. But do not build your peace on a foundation you have not tested, and do not let the world forget entirely, even as it must be allowed to disbelieve. Someone in every generation should half remember. That is all the defense there ever is against a thing like this. Not a cure. Only someone somewhere who does not entirely laugh. So I have written this. Not to be believed, I have given up on that, but so that it exists, so that in some drawer, in some archive, in some record no one reads, there is an account, and so that someone in some generation coming across it might not entirely laugh. I have written it in the daylight, always in the daylight, in the self that is still mine. The other self I keep at the edge, quiet, held at the threshold, the way you keep a thing you have not defeated but have, for the length of one life, persuaded to be still. The road still climbs somewhere until the trees give out. I have chosen to believe the house at the top of it is empty now. I have chosen it the way Van Helsing chose it, knowingly, without proof, because a person must be able to sleep. But I keep this account, and I do not entirely laugh. And that, he taught me, is the only watch that has ever been kept against the long winter. Not a wall, not a weapon, not a cure, but a single person in each generation who remembers enough to be afraid, and lives anyway in the daylight, and loves anyway, and keeps the record, and does not entirely laugh. The winter was very long. It is over now, they say. I have chosen to believe them. I keep the record all the same. The end.